Geek Out! That's right, kids. Time to sit around the campfire for the first episode of The Long Night at Camp Blood, a Geek Out retrospective of the Friday the 13th film series. And I am your host. You'll recognize me from the shows Catching Up and Laserdicks, as well as regularly appearing on several of the other shows on the Geek Out podcasting network. I am Chris Nolan. And today I'm going to be flying solo, but in the future I do intend on having a couple guest hosts here and there. But for today I wanted to keep it cool, keep it simple, keep it me, keep it real. And we're going to be talking about the first installment of the Friday the 13th film franchise. In the year 1957, a young boy attending summer camp at Camp Crystal Lake drowns while the counselors who were meant to be watching him were preoccupied having sex. The following year, those same counselors were mysteriously murdered during a similar session of promiscuity. The camp then remains closed for 21 years until new owner Steve Christy, son of the original owners, decides it's time to reopen the camp, ignoring the several failed attempts by his parents in the meantime. During the first few days of summer, when the newly hired counselors arrive to help clean up and repair the camp, they're dispatched one by an unseen killer. Everything seems to be tied back to the unfortunate death of that young boy. But why? So, this, like I said, first installment of the now legendary Friday the 13th film franchise. It is spawned, including the remake and Freddy vs. Jason, 12 movies, with later this year a 13th installment coming, if I've done my math correctly. Yes, yeah, because Jason X is the last one of the quote-unquote classic Jason series, and then Freddy vs. Jason is number 11, and the remake is 12. Another new remake coming out this year, 2017, makes it number 13, which, what a monumental occasion is that? The 13th Friday the 13th film? It better be good. This year also marks the release of Friday the 13th, the game, which is actually what inspired me to do this show. I've always, kind of back burner enjoyed slasher movies in general. Friday the 13th being one of the big powerhouses, basically the movie that brought the slasher franchise to the forefront. Although I will discuss later that it's not the original slasher movie. Just to calm down anyone that might be listening to this and being like, Black Christmas or Halloween, because of course Halloween, But I mean, it even dates back to Psycho. Psycho is technically a slasher movie, and that came out way before this movie. Like, Psycho was still like Hitchcockian, and they didn't, the Psycho being a slasher movie is separate because it's so much older and it didn't spawn a craze. Whereas you could argue that Black Christmas, Halloween were all big influences on what then became the slasher film era, if you want to call it that. Friday the 13th being the first one to have like a real budget and good distribution behind it. So that's why it's, popularized as like one of the more famous slasher movies. So this year I bought the Friday the 13th game because it looked cool. It was kickstarted. I thought that was pretty fancy. At the time of recording this, the game itself hasn't been released yet, but I did partake in the closed beta for it because I pre-ordered the game, and it was so much fun that it caused me to want to re-watch the series. Found out that it was free or no extra charge streaming on Amazon if you have Amazon Prime for the Paramount Pictures Friday the 13th movies, which means all the way from the first one up until Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. And then, as most of you, I'm sure, will already know, the rights were sold to New Line Cinema, and I guess that means Jason Goes to Hell, Jason X, Freddy vs. Jason, and the subsequent remake which I don't even know off the top of my head if that's still New Line Cinema or if that's someone else again, are not part of that package because, studio deals and whatnot. So I rewatched them, or at least I rewatched up until Jason Takes Manhattan, and I was like, I'm really enjoying this. I want to share the love. I'm going to talk about it. And so I used my powers of being, one of the producers for the Geek Out Podcasting Network and decided to make my own show. And so that's what I'm doing. Like I've said about 12 times, today we're talking about the first Friday the 13th movie. I just finished watching it for the second time in as many weeks. So it's pretty fresh in my brain. Let's go over some of the deets. So as I said in the description that I read, technically the story starts in 1957, although we don't actually see anything from that year of summer camp. That's just when Jason drowns. And in this movie, he drowns. He's dead. There is no Jason in this movie. Spoilers. I hope you've seen it. It's over 30 years old. It's almost 40 years old at this point. But yes, in the very first Friday the 13th movie, the killer is a vengeful Mrs. Voorhees, Jason's mom. She is upset that the two counselors, Barry and Claudette, were off having the sex while Jason was drowning. Jason was in the lake. They are the ones that are supposed to be watching him, taking care of him, because he is a special needs boy. They're doing the dirty, and he drowns while playing in the lake. Miss Voorhees takes it pretty personally because, it's her kid. It's her prerogative to take that personally. The following year, 1958, that's where the movie starts. Camp's back in session. Barry and Claudette are still counselors there, but Miss Voorhees, she was able to talk Mr. Christy into letting her cook again because she was the chef for the camp. And during that summer, she finds Barry and Claudette again in flagrante delicto, banging, and dispatches them right there. Boom, that's the cold open. And you see the iconic Friday the 13th text, zoom, or, fly in, break glass. And apparently that was the thing that made this movie called Friday the 13th. I'll mention it later, but Mr. Cunningham, the producer and director, had just had that vision, and he was like, yes, call it Friday the 13th. But Cunningham, it makes no sense. Well, make Jason's birthday Friday the 13th, and make that day be the day that this movie's taking place. Okay. So 21 years pass. Every couple years, Papa Christy, the owner of the camp, is like, oh, maybe I'll try opening up, Camp Crystal Lake again. And Pamela Voorhees does something to stop that. She one year they find that the water has been dirtied and is unusable, so they can't open up the camp because there's no drinking water. Another year, she messes with the power generators and whatnot to the point where they can't open up. So finally, Papa Christy gives up, and he's like, fine, whatever, I'm not going to try it. Then Steve Christy comes along, his son, and he's like, you know what? I'm going to try opening up the camp. And I guess all the things that Mama Voorhees does, I'm going to mostly call her Mrs. Voorhees, just so you know, because she's not actually called Pamela in this movie. She even introduces herself as Mrs. Voorhees, so in my head, she's always been Mrs. Voorhees. I know that she's credited as Pamela Voorhees, but, it's never actually said, so it's weird for me to call her that. It's even weird for me to call Barry and Claudette. But that was, I needed to give them some name, and that's what they're credited as, even though it's never said in the movie. But so Mrs. Voorhees has done things to sabotage it, but nothing works. Steve Christy is still like, no, fuck it, I'm gonna open this place, and I'm gonna open it good. So that's why she goes on her killing spree in the movie. And that's where the movie pretty much picks up. So 21 years have passed. It's now 1979. And Steve has gotten all the counselors together. They're trying to fix up the place. They've got 2 weeks before the summer starts. So he calls them all there to rebuild the camp and train. and Mrs. Voorhees comes along and picks them off one by one, starting with Miss Unfortunate Annie, which I have always disliked this kill because the Friday the 13th movies, at least, always had like a sense of morality to them. Like for the most part, I will point out other times when innocents are killed, but for the most part, everyone has somehow earned getting killed off, either by having sex, using drugs or alcohol, or just downright being an asshole that you're just like, fucking kill this guy. I want him dead. Annie does nothing to deserve it. She even though I've seen this movie multiple times, almost every time she comes on screen and starts talking about, how wide-eyed and bushy-tailed she is and how much she loves working with children. She doesn't even like calling them kids. She calls them children. I'm like, oh, this girl is, the survivor. She's the virgin. She's the Jamie Lee Curtis. She's the Nancy. Nope. She gets killed off real quick. She's actually the first, quote unquote proper death. If you choose to not count the cold open, because that's a glorified flashback. So she's killed off, and then after that, one by one, the kids are taken out until it's down to just Alice and Mama Voorhees, and they go to it. And I gotta say, rewatching these movies, like for the longest time, I was just like, oh, these are just stupid slasher movies, like low budget, no acting talent. Like, it's just people want to see kids get chopped up. And yes, it is. We'll talk about the budget in a little bit. It is definitely a low budget movie, but like rewatching it, and I went to film school, just to give a background, just in case you haven't heard me say that a million times on the other podcasts I'm on. But this, like, looking at it from the eye of, like, now that I've gone to film school, like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, for as low budgeted as it is, and as, crap the acting is arguably, it's really well shot. And part of that is because it's from the late 70s, early 80s. It was shot on film, and that's always going to be near and dear to my heart as, like, a pretty way to watch a movie. But also, like, the shots are set up well. The compositions are good. The directing is good. The camera work is really good. Like when it goes to Mrs. Voorhees' perspective, or the killer's perspective, it's shaky and moody and stuff like that, and that makes sense. And it's not like that throughout the whole thing. It's very smooth when it's just showing the counselors and stuff like that, and very pretty. And like shooting at a lake and a camp is always going to be full of like beautiful landscapes to shoot on, and they really utilize that. So I apologize and take back several of the things that I've said about the Friday the 13th film franchise, and and good on them. They keep that up for a good couple movies. I'll talk about when it starts to nosedive, because when it goes down hard. And to its credit, like, it knew that where to take the audience, and it's like I won't knock them for going silly and campy later on, because like it still worked for them. And as Cunningham says, like, it was always part of the idea for it to be kind of silly. But like I just what is it, around like part 5 or part 6 is where I start to check out totally, and it doesn't come back until almost Freddy vs. Jason, to be honest, although there's some wonderful things about Jason X, and we'll get into that in 10 months. So now on to some more of the boring business stuff. I read through the Wikipedia page and condensed a lot of it to easily digestible stuff. But just know that that's my main source on this, because I'm lazy. And if you want to read more, I turned paragraphs into sentences and stuff like that. If you want to read more, go to the Wikipedia page. Go to other websites that talk about Friday the 13th, because I know there's a ton. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'll if it's decent enough, I'll bring it up on a future episode, with corrections and editorials and whatnot. But so here's the boring stuff, the behind the scenes stuff, and I'm going to be honest, a lot of this is actually really interesting. So if you actually do find it boring, I don't know how to please you. So business stuff. It was released on May 9th, not Friday the 13th, May 9th, 1980 by Paramount Studios domestically. You know what? I forgot to include who released it internationally, but that's a big thing. It got an international release. I might mention it later in this thing. It's been a couple days since I wrote this, so oops. Runtime is officially 95 minutes. It was written by Victor Miller and produced and directed by Sean S. Cunningham, the Mr. Cunningham that I've referenced several times. Let's see. Filmed at the Boy Scout camp No Be Bo Sco in Hardwick, New Jersey. Which, fun fact, that camp still is in operation today, or at least as of the last time the Wikipedia article was updated for that camp, which I think was 2014. And every year they actually theme their summer camps after movies, mostly movies. The article on Wikipedia has this whole big thing. It's pretty cool. I want to check it out. I'm kind of jealous of the kids that got to go there. One, because it was the, Camp Crystal Lake, and two, just because it sounds so interesting. Speaking of which, I just realized, the title of this podcast, I should probably explain that. Long Night at Camp Blood is actually the original working title. You know what? I mentioned that in the write-up, but whatever. Long Night at Camp Blood. That was the original working title. And it's pretty awesome name if you ask me, but Friday the 13th, definitely a lot more concise, and it's already in the lexicon, so I get it. Budget, $550,000 US, which I mentioned it later, but off the top of my head, I think that's only like 1 million in today's dollars-ish. It's about, inflation is about double what it was in the early 80s right now, so that's still, that's ridiculously low budget. I mean, that's like, that's around like Clerks level low budget, because I think Clerks was only like 500,000 when it came out. Somewhere between 500,000 and a million. I can't imagine it was more than 1 million. Sorry, I don't have the figures in front of me. And the gross. So remember, 550,000 to make it. Gross domestically, $39.7 million. And with international added to that, 59.8. It was about 20-something international, or about 20 international. So those are the figures. Then a little backstory. So Cunningham had previously worked with Wes Craven on Last House on the Left, which coupled with his love of working on that and his inspiration from watching John Carpenter's Halloween, he wanted to make a horror movie himself that was both visually stunning, makes you jump out of your seat, and be more of a roller coaster ride than Last House on the Left. So that's what kind of started the brainchild of Friday the 13th. He did intend, like I said, he did intend it to be scary, but also wanted to make the audience laugh. And there's the bit about working title being A Long Night at Camp Blood. But as I said earlier, Cunningham liked the idea of calling it Friday the 13th so much that he actually rushed ads in Variety to weed out potential lawsuits, just in case someone already had the rights for it, which apparently someone did. There was a movie that came out a couple years earlier called Friday the 13th, The Orphan, and there was stories, or there's rumor, maybe it's fact, who knows, that there was going to be a lawsuit, but we'll just say that it was settled out of court because no actual legal action ended up being taken. So Miller, the writer, loved the idea of inventing a killer who turned out to be a mother. So like Miller and Cunningham had, kind of fleshed out the idea of, it being a revenge story, with Mrs. Voorhees being the ultimate killer. He's even quoted as saying, "I took motherhood and turned it on its head, and then I think that was great fun. Mrs. Voorhees was the mother I'd always wanted, a mother who would have killed for her kids." And he's also been quoted as saying, or he's also known to say that he really does not like that Jason was resurrected for the subsequent sequels, even going as far as to saying Jason was dead from the very beginning. He was a victim, not a villain. And I totally get that. Just stepping aside from the facts right quick, especially like just watching it just this time, Betsy Palmer's portrayal of Mrs. Voorhees was so good. And like the whole, like her just going completely nuts because of her son's death, to spawn arguably a 21-year killing spree. She plays it so perfectly and so well that I, as much as I love the series and I love Jason Voorhees as the killer, the villain, it does kind of sully all that work that Miller put into it and that Betsy Palmer put into the character. And it's a shame. It's a shame that it worked out so well that I think that the writers of Part 2 specifically should be unapologetic, but at the same time, like I get where Miller's coming from. Even the original script didn't feature Jason, like the scene at the end where he pops out of the water. The original script, Miller's script, does not have that in it. And in fact, it was Tom Savini who was like, you gotta have something in there. Like Tom Savini had just watched Carrie and was like, that's such a great, spooky ending, with the hand coming out of the grave. It doesn't make any sense, but it's a great twist. And like the whole reason, there's a quote from Tom Savini, the whole reason for the cliffhanger at the end was, I had just seen Carrie, so we thought that we need a chair jumper like that. And I said, let's bring in Jason. So Tom Savini is basically to blame that Jason ever got put into the mix, just because of that. And I guess to a lesser extent, Stephen King and Sissy Spacek. So then we talk about casting. Casting focused on likable characters, believable as responsible counselors, or more so believable as responsible counselors rather than good actors. Kevin Bacon, Laurie Bartram, Peter Brower, and Adrian King were the first ones cast. All of them had kind of like worked on soaps and stuff like that, which the casting company that Cunningham and Miller went with, they were predominantly, working with soaps. So like they picked a whole bunch of these actors that they had already, worked with on that. So Adrian King, who plays Alice, was just friends with someone who worked at the company. I don't even think she auditioned. I might have written that somewhere. Or no, she got the audition because she knew. It was Robbie Morgan who played Annie, who didn't even audition. She just looked like a counselor type, and that was good enough. At least half the cast already knew each other from working on soaps. Mike Nelson's Ned is believed to actually be the start of the practical Joker victim, to the extent that Ned didn't even know he was in a horror movie until he was handed the full script. But for his audition, all he had were these comedic scenes, and that makes sense because 95% of Ned's character is just a practical joker, goofball. So he looked at the script and thought that it was a comedy for whatever reason, named Friday the 13th. And then Harry Crosby, who plays Bill, just as a fun fact, is the son of Bing Crosby. Nothing much else to say about him. And then I already talked about Annie, who just looks like a counselor, which is fine, because that's all she needed to be. Then let's talk about Mrs. Voorhees for a quick second. So the first person that they talked to was Estelle Parsons, who ultimately declined to play the role. She was much like Betsy Palmer. She was a fairly well-known actress at the time. Fun fact about her is that she still is working, most recently in the TV shows The Good Wife and Grace and Frankie. But that's all I really looked into Estelle Parsons. Beyond that, I don't really know much about her because she didn't get the role. Betsy Palmer got the role. And she accepted it only because she needed a car. She actually was quoted as saying that she thinks it's complete shit. A piece of shit. The completed movie, and probably thought it while she was reading the script too. Understandable. She was like a serious actress, and she was always playing wholesome parts and stuff like that. And then they're like, "Hey, do you want to be in this slasher movie where you're the killer, completely against type?" But one of the cool things about her is that she was encouraged by Cunningham to not be over the top and to make it as serious as possible. So like still within her type of acting, which he said, and I agree as the viewer, makes it that much more terrifying that she's so like lucid through the whole movie. And then fun fact, because of I believe her health problems, most of the movie she is portrayed by Tasu Stavrakis, who is Tom Savini's assistant, or was at least on this movie. So like pretty much anytime you see Mrs. Voorhees' just hand come in from the shot, or we'll go ahead and say it like it is, the killer's hand, because it's totally not Mrs. Voorhees' hands. It's a man's hand. It's a big, beefy hand. That's Tasso's hand, and which give or take, like that is a great misdirect, because this entire time you think it's some crazy dude out in the forest killing these kids. I'll mention it later, but there was supposed to be like even bigger misdirect, which kind of fell flat. But we'll get to that later. I have this big, huge quote from Betsy Palmer about preparing Mrs. Voorhees. I'm going to try to get through it all without screwing up. But like, I didn't want to add so much text, but after reading through it, I was just like, you know what, I need this, or I need to say it, because it's such beautiful. Like, even though she thinks this role is crap, she thinks the movie is a piece of shit, just the dedication to her craft is beautiful, and I think it needs to be celebrated. So I'm going to read this whole thing. It's a huge monologue. And I'm not going to try to do her voice. Being an actress who uses the Stanislavski method, I always try to find details about my character. With Pamela, I began with a class ring that I remember reading in the script that she'd worn. Starting with that, I traced Pamela back to my own high school days in the early 1940s. So it's 1944, a very conservative time, and Pamela has a steady boyfriend. They have sex, which is very bad, of course, and Pamela soon gets pregnant with Jason. The father takes off, and when Pamela tells her parents, they disown her because having babies out of wedlock isn't something that good girls do. I think she took Jason and raised him the best she could, but he turned out to be a very strange boy. She took lots of odd jobs, and one of those jobs was a cook at a summer camp. Then Jason drowns, and her whole world collapses. What were the counselors doing instead of watching Jason? They were having sex, which is the way that she got into trouble. From that point on, Pamela became very psychotic and puritanical in her attitudes, as she was determined to kill all of the immoral camp counselors. That's just beautiful. Like me, not an actor, but I've done acting. Me, I would have just looked at it and been like, okay, she went crazy because her kid died. Let's do this. But she came up with this whole beautiful backstory, and like, she does get a lot of credit for such a great job, but like, I think she should get a lot of credit for just how beautiful that is real quick. Then there's Crazy Ralph, who is the misdirect that I was talking about earlier. Like, Crazy Ralph is the guy that Annie and the other counselors later run into, who's all like, you're all doomed, you're gonna die. That era, like every horror movie had to have someone like that, or at least it seems. Maybe I don't know, maybe as someone that was too young at the time, maybe Crazy Ralph is what invented it, and, you know, chicken and the egg. But, like, so you have Crazy Ralph, and he was written in as 2 parts, foreshadowing and being a red herring, a misdirect. And that's what I was saying, you know, like, those Meefy hands, as I said, could have been his. But it kind of falls flat. It's just kind of like a annoying character. At least I've always found it as annoying. I don't like characters like that, which is great because it happens so many more times in the series. But at least we get to see him die later on, and we'll talk about that in that particular movie. So let's talk about the music. There's a conscious effort to only include music when the killer is in the scene. Notably, there's a scene where one of the girls is setting up the archery area. One of the guys shoots an arrow into the target and just misses her. It's a huge scare, but if you notice, there's no music, and that was a choice. And that's from I feel terrible because I didn't write his name, but that's from the guy that did the music for the movie. And oftentimes the music would actually cut out right before something happens, giving the audience a false sense of security. They let their guards down, and then the score just kicks in right when, you know, like dead body falls or, you know, gets thrown through the window and scares the shit out of everyone. And then as it's easy to figure this out. It's no big surprise, but the score bears a lot of similarities to Jaws, even down to the point where, like, the main kind of like warning that Jason, or not Jason, the main warning that the killer is coming close is a yeah, which is very reminiscent of the Jaws da-dun, da-dun, you know. And that was a choice. You know, the Jaws had come out 4 years earlier and was a huge success. Started the summer blockbusters, and then the ethereal chorus of ki, 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 ma, 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 represented Jason in Mrs. Voorhees' head saying "kill them, mommy" or "kill her, mommy." Which so I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna say it right now. I, like many people, will you know, up until reading this article and setting up this write up, I was still in the camp that it's chi 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 pa pa pa, and to the point where I would actually say chi 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 pa 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 kill kill kill, something like that. Like, that's what I have heard always. But reading this article and seeing that it's actually like the guy that composed the music deconstructed the phrase "kill her mommy" to make the you know, I'm like, all right, fine, I'll accept that because I, you know what's going on, and stuff, stuff. So then let's talk about distribution. Get back to some of those numbers and whatnot. So, like I said, Paramount was the one that bought the rights to it for distribution in America. They paid $1.5 million to distribute it through the country, and spent an additional $500,000 on advertising, which then, once the movie came out and they saw how successful it was going, grossing $6 million just opening weekend, they doubled that. They put in another $500,000 for marketing after the release. Usually, movies start to, like, they'll do a big push after opening weekend to get people in there for the second week, but it's rarely as much as the before the movie comes out advertising. So the fact that they spent the exact same amount before and after its release is pretty big. Let's see, like I said, grossed $6 million opening weekend. Sorry, not night. And ranked 18th highest grossing film that year. Just to put in a little bit of perspective, some of the other horror movies that came out that year were The Shining, Prom Night, The Fog, and Dressed to Kill, which I should have looked into how those movies did respectively, but they were on, you know, the top whatever of that year. Friday the 13th in good company for horror movies that year. And then also just the fact that it got an international release in general, because it's still technically an independent movie. Paramount only picked it up for distribution. It's still produced independently. So the fact that it got an international release was saying something big, and looks like I forgot to write down who it did. I think it was Sony, but that's probably wrong. And then just a fun fact. I'm going to have to come up with some clever name for that since I have so many of these fun facts in it. Adjusting to 2014, because that's when this was written, that's when the calculations were done from the shit that I read. The budget adjusted is $4.5 million and grossed $114 million. That's like Avengers, not Avengers because that was like over 200 million, but like that's like around like what Suicide Squad got. I think Suicide Squad grossed like $130 million. That might just be in its opening weekend, whereas this is talking about total gross. But still, an independent movie grossing almost as much overall as some big blockbuster movie does in its opening weekend is huge. And as you probably guessed it, critics didn't like it. Surprise, surprise. Critics don't like horror movies. Most notably, Gene Siskel had it in for this movie, apparently. He called Cunningham, the writer and or the director and producer, if you've forgotten, one of the most despicable creatures ever to infest the movie business, and encouraged people to write to various cast and crew members expressing their contempt. Like, he released the address, I believe it was of one of the executives, and then it implied ways to contact Betsy Palmer as well, just being like, tell these people how terrible they are. They are awful. And then Siskel and Ebert both spent an entire episode of their show berating the movie and claiming that it makes audience root for the killer, which, okay, I'll give them that, because you watch the movie and you're like, yeah, Jason, kill these kids. You know, they're terrible people. Except for Annie. She doesn't deserve to die. So I'll give Siskel and Ebert that's a fair point. Then, of course, in retrospect, some critics would later send praise, mainly towards the score, makeup effects, and, like I said, Betsy Palmer's role. She did an amazing job. That year that Friday the 13th, the original, came out, was also the first year of the Golden Raspberry Awards, and it was nominated for 2. Did not win either of them, but it's a nice honorable mention that they got in there. The first one was for the worst picture, which went to Can't Stop the Music, the Village People biopic, and then the other one for worst supporting actress for Betsy Palmer, and that one went to Amy Irving in the movie Honeysuckle Rose, which I don't know anything about. Home video release. It's on VHS, Laserdisc, DVD, Blu-ray, and digital. And in 2009, there was an uncut release, which features a whopping 10 seconds, which basically it's a couple seconds here, a couple seconds there, a couple seconds, everywhere for some of the kills, which I guess were deemed too gruesome for audiences. Now you have, an extra 2 seconds when I think Kevin Bacon gets stabbed with the arrowhead, when Annie's throat gets slashed, and Betsy Palmer, when Miss Voorhees' head gets chopped off. You get a couple more seconds of that. Bully for you. And let's see. In 1987, 8 years after the release of the movie, there was a book adaptation that was released, adding scenes, mainly, or for the most part, it was just straight adaptation. A couple scenes added here and there of Miss Voorhees' backstory, which is how I knew some of the facts about her coming back and messing with the camp. So that's it for the boring stuff. If you found that boring, sorry. That was good chunk of the episode so far. So then I just have a couple other facts that when I was dreaming up this idea, I was like, well, what are some things that I would want to talk about? So I listed a couple things, rewatched the movie just now to pull that up. Friday the 13th, well known for its long cold opens. In fact, I'll probably mention this again at part 2, but part 2 has one of the longest cold opens in film. But so this particular movie, cold open, 5 minutes and 13 seconds. Location, both within the universe and in real life, takes place at Camp Crystal Lake, and that's filmed, like I said, at Camp No B Bosco in Hardwick, New Jersey. Camp Crystal Lake also exists in New Jersey. Just in case no one knew that, yes, this is a Jersey movie. Timeline that the movie takes place, like I said, it starts in 1958. Or no, well, no. The movie itself starts in 1958. We never see really any scenes from 1957, save for Mrs. Voorhees having a weird acid flashback to her son drowning. So movie starts in 1958, ends in 1979, with the bulk of it taking place on a random Friday the 13th in 1979. Kill count for the movie, Jason, because this was a list that I drew up for the entire series, and then overall total for the series. Kill count in this movie, 10, with Mrs. Voorhees being number 10. Jason, 0, because like I said, he essentially isn't in this movie, bringing the overall total for the series so far 10 kills. Best kill, in my opinion, is going to be Jack, the character played by Kevin Bacon, with the arrowhead speared through his throat. Feel free to tweet me if you disagree. It's at EG Nolan. We'll start a conversation. Lamest kill. I didn't really write one because there were no like lame kills per se. A lot of almost half of them were off screen, which is kind of lame. But I'm going to go ahead and give the credit for the lamest kill to Annie, who, as I've said, is innocent. She doesn't deserve to die. Fight me. So then, a classic thing in all of these Friday movies, about halfway, maybe 2/3 of the way through, Jason just goes on a killing spree and just starts popping them off, like, right after the other. This movie is no less. You get a couple kills right off the bat. Like I said, burying Claudette in the cold open and Annie within the next couple minutes. And that's all part of the first act, just to make sure you guys know that there's going to be death in this movie. Then Ned gets killed to remind you that people are dying in this movie about 20 minutes later. I don't count that as the killing spree because it happens off screen. So Jack being the next kill at the 42-minute, 50-second mark is the start of the killing spree. And then that killing spree lasts for approximately 27 minutes and 55 seconds. I say approximately because the final quote-unquote kill was Bill, who we don't actually see him get killed. He's killed off screen. All we have is that Alice finds his body at the 1 hour, 10 minute, 45 second mark. That's how much I went into doing this research. And yet I didn't get the name of the guy that scored the film. Fuck me, right? 27 minutes and 55 seconds for the length of the killing spree. Are there any survivors? Alice. And then technically, like, the town folk, but they weren't involved at all, so I don't count them. It's just the counselors who were there at the camp, in the proximity of where the killings were taking place. Who plays Jason? We lucked out on this one, even though Jason technically isn't in this movie. He is in a fever dream of Alice, where he jumps out of the lake, and that lake monster Jason is played by Ari Lemon. And then throughout the series, Jason goes through quite some evolution, so I wanted to talk about that. What's the evolution of Jason? In this movie, he's a drowned boy. He drowns at the beginning of the movie. Or actually, we don't find out that he drowned until Betsy Palmer's monologuing at the end. But yeah, so he drowned before the movie started. And then we see him jump out of the lake as a, resurrected corpse like I said, in a dream. So I still argue that he's not actually in the movie, because all we see is, flashbacks from Mommy and fever dream from Alice. What weapons were used specifically by the killer? There's a cooking and hunting knives, arrows, an axe, and the good old-fashioned machete. Now, the machete doesn't... the machete is waved around, but the only kill that it actually makes is Mrs. Voorhees herself when Alice steals it away, just as a, notable mention. And in that same vein, there is a rifle that's picked up and used as a melee weapon, but again, that's by Alice, and no shot is ever fired because she was not able to get the ammo. Okay, and then going on with the recurring the recurring complaint about Annie's death. Do the victims deserve to die? Like I said, this movie is rife with moral judgment, and most of the time it's set up that the characters, in some way, shape, or form, deserve to die. So let's go through the list. Fornicators: Barry, Claudette, Jack, Marcy. Assholes: Ned. Fuck Ned. Drug or alcohol users: Alice, Brenda, Bill. You'll notice that I said Alice. She's the one that ultimately survives. She's supposed to be the untouched virgin, but nope, she drank alcohol and smoked the reefer, or grass, as they called it in the scene. And then innocents: Annie and Steve. Steve, the only thing he did wrong was going back to town to do something. I forget what it was right now. And also, wanting to reopen a camp so that kids could go to camp. Yes, you could argue that he, by doing that, he was, being insensitive to Mrs. Voorhees, but I don't. I don't count that. He was an innocent. He didn't deserve to die. How was the killer defeated? Machete decapitation in a damn cool scene. Now, I will give honorable mention to getting knocked over and cutting her, busting her head open, because that was the fake out kill. And then Alice goes down to the lake and rests, lets it all go, and then Mrs. Voorhees comes up behind her with the machete. Now, I mention that because that happens a lot in these movies. That I think I'll make a more stink when one of these Friday the 13th movies doesn't end at the pier to the lake, or the dock to the lake, which I guess for sure, right off the top of my head, Jason Takes Manhattan. It's like the only one that I can think of right off, like I said, right off the top of my head. And then how does Jason come back at the end for the twist? I mentioned it before. He jumps out of the lake, but that's, again, in Alice's dream. In this movie, Jason is dead. There is no Jason in this movie. And that's about it for what I have written down. Is there anything I missed? Anything I went on too long about? Tweet me. Like I said, it's at EG Nolan, or you can tweet the Geek Out Podcast. I believe it's just Geek Out Podcast for our Twitter handle. I am a consummate professional, and I know everything before I start the show. Otherwise, yeah, tweet me, EG Nolan. And we'll talk about Friday the 13th. And maybe we'll talk about Nightmare on Elm Street, too, because I still like Freddy Krueger better. Anyway, let's all sing Kumbaya, and we'll see each other next summer for Part 2. And by next summer, I mean like next month. I'm not going to do this yearly. It's going to be about monthly. But Kumbaya, my lord. Kumbaya.
This has been another Geek Out production. If you enjoyed what you heard, hey, we've got a new commentary every Monday. We've got a special episode every Friday. Of course, there's the usual catching up show every Wednesday. And you get book club episodes just about every Tuesday these days. Thanks for listening.